I found a man dead in Lower Manhattan. No struggle, no blood, just silence. No one knew who he was. His secrets were buried deep, but I dug them up, piece by piece. What I uncovered wasn't just a murder, it was a web of lies, and I'm the one who tore it apart. The street was silent. Too silent. The kind of silence you only get in places where something's gone wrong, but no one wants to say it out loud. South of Wall Street, tucked between the high-rises and the hum of the city that never sleeps, there was a spot where time had almost stopped. It was a narrow street, quiet as a graveyard, until I found the body. He was lying there, face up, eyes staring into nothing. His clothes were clean, pressed. Late 60s maybe. Gray hair, but no sign of struggle. No blood. Nothing to suggest violence. But that stillness spoke louder than anything else in the city. It was like he had simply collapsed in the middle of his walk, right there in the street, with no one the wiser. The kind of death that doesn't leave a mark, but still makes the world stop for a moment. I crouched down to take a closer look, checking his pulse even though I knew it was too late. He was cold. The air felt colder around him, like it was holding its breath. There was nothing about him that screamed foul play, but that's always how it starts, isn't it? The first thing people do when they see something they don't understand is convince themselves it's nothing. That's what I did at first. I thought maybe he had just died of natural causes. Maybe he was just an old man who finally gave up. But something didn't sit right. Not the way his shoes were neatly aligned, or the way his coat was pressed, as though he had just come from a meeting, a lunch, maybe a life he was trying to hide. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The street was practically deserted when I found him, but that wasn't unusual for this part of town. It was early enough in the day for the workers to be hustling to their next meeting, too early for tourists to be wandering the cobblestones. There was no commotion, no panicked calls to the police, no frantic searches for answers. Just stillness. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the body, trying to find something that made sense, something that explained it. But the longer I looked, the less I understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't natural. The man had been placed there, and someone had made sure he wouldn't be found until they were good and ready. I called it in, but I knew, deep down, that this wasn't going to be one of those cases where you tie up all the loose ends quickly. This wasn't just some random death. I could feel it in my gut. This man wasn't just another victim of time. He was someone with a story, someone with secrets buried deep, and I was going to uncover them, whether anyone wanted me to or not. I didn't know it yet, but I had just stepped into something that would take me down a path I wasn't ready for. But it was too late. The digging had already begun. Leonard McAllister. That was the name on his ID. I saw it in black and white, tucked away in a file at the precinct. Simple enough. Just another man who lived in the city, worked his job, went home. At least, that's what the record said. But I could already tell there was something off. The thing about cases like these is that everything looks fine on the surface, until you start peeling back the layers. And once you do, everything begins to unravel. McAllister's background was as ordinary as they come. Born in Brooklyn. Worked for a small accounting firm for the better part of 20 years. No criminal record, no history of mental illness. A quiet man by all accounts. No one in the neighborhood had ever seen him cause trouble. And yet, there was something missing, something that didn't quite fit. His life was a blank slate, and that alone should have raised flags. People don't just disappear off the grid like that without a reason. Sure, some folks decide to drop off the face of the earth, get lost on purpose. But that's not usually the case. And McAllister hadn't just disappeared for a week, a month, or a year. He'd vanished from the system entirely. No credit reports, no tax filings, no phone records, nothing. It was like he never existed in the first place. I pulled up the old records from the firm he'd worked at. It wasn't a huge company, just a small-time operation tucked away in an office on the edge of the financial district. They had no idea what had happened to him either. One day he'd just stopped showing up. No note, no warning. They hadn't even bothered to report him missing. To them, it was like he'd just slipped through the cracks of their lives, and they moved on. But when I called his old colleagues, I noticed something. They didn't seem too interested in talking about him. The responses were short, polite, but guarded. almost like they were hiding something. They said he was a quiet guy, that he kept to himself, but no one could really tell me why he'd suddenly disappeared. Not a word about his family, his personal life, or anything beyond what he'd done at work. All they had was the same vague memory. He'd worked, and then one day he was gone. The more I dug, the more I realized that Leonard McAllister had a secret. And it wasn't just the fact that he'd dropped off the radar. It was the way the people around him had erased him from their own memories. That kind of thing doesn't happen without a reason. I dug deeper, and it was in the quietest corners of the city that I found the first hint of what McAllister had been hiding. It was a small note left behind in the office's back room, a scribbled message, a name, and a number. It was barely legible, but it was enough to get me started. I traced the name and the number, and that's when I stumbled across the first real lead. McAllister had been involved in something bigger than I could have imagined, something buried beneath the surface of this city's clean streets and polished buildings. And the deeper I went, the more I realized that Leonard McAllister wasn't just another lost soul. He was someone who had been running from something or someone powerful enough to make sure he stayed buried. Whatever it wasn't just a secret, it was a threat. And I was starting to realize I was getting too close to uncovering it. The musty smell of old paper hit me the second I stepped into the archives. It was the kind of smell you couldn't escape once you'd inhaled it. Thick, like dust and forgotten history. I had a feeling that's exactly what I was chasing, a history that no one had cared to remember. I spent hours flipping through records, clippings, anything I could find that had anything to do with Leonard McAllister. The more I looked, the less sense it made. His life was a series of disconnected fragments, pieced together like a broken puzzle. There were some records, brief mentions of him in financial reports, and that was it. A man with no family history, no connections to anyone who mattered. Or so it seemed. But as I dug deeper, I found something. A faded newspaper clipping from the 70s, buried at the bottom of an old file. It was yellowed and cracked, but the headline still jumped out at me. Local man found dead, ties to organized crime suspected. My heart skipped a beat. The date on the article was just a year before McAllister had vanished from the system, and the photo next to it made my gut tighten. The man in the photograph was McAllister, but there was something else. The man standing next to him, someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't belong in this part of his life. The photo was grainy, but the man beside McAllister was unmistakable. He was younger, mid-30s maybe, wearing a sharp suit that screamed, "Money." His expression was intense, like he was hiding something beneath that carefully cultivated smile. And the background, the scene looked like some kind of upscale club, or maybe a hotel lobby, but nothing about it fit the quiet, unassuming life McAllister had led up until that point. I stared at the photograph for a long time. McAllister, younger, standing next to a man who looked like he had far more to hide than McAllister ever did. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment when everything had changed for him, the one thing that turned his life upside down, that set him on a path that would lead to his death. I pulled up more clippings from the same time period. There were mentions of McAllister's name here and there, but it was always in relation to a vague reference to a business deal gone wrong. The words money laundering, dirty money, and organized crime cropped up in the background, but no one could ever tie the dots together. Just whispers, just rumors, a story that was meant to stay buried. McAllister's name had been tucked away, as though the people involved wanted him erased as quickly as possible. But then I found something else, something that chilled me to my core. A letter, handwritten in the same file. It was a note from McAllister to someone named Richard Voss. The letter was brief, but it spoke volumes. McAllister had been involved in something far deeper than I could have ever imagined. Voss was no stranger to the world of organized crime, and McAllister had been dragged into it unwillingly, it seemed. The note talked about debts, favors owed, and how McAllister was in way over his head. That was when the pieces started to come together. McAllister hadn't just disappeared. He'd been forced out. Someone had made sure of that. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now he was dead. And the people responsible? They were still out there pulling the strings. I closed the file and leaned back in my chair, the weight of the truth heavy on my chest. The deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just about one man's death. It was about something much bigger, something dangerous enough to bury the truth, something that would go to any length to keep it hidden. And I was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like it was suffocating you, pressing in from all sides. I stood in front of the door for a long moment before knocking, unsure of what I would find. When I had learned that McAllister had a wife, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would she be a grieving widow, lost in the weight of her husband's death? Or would she be someone else entirely? Someone with a secret to protect? She opened the door slowly, her face pale and drawn. The dark circles under her eyes told me she hadn't slept in days. I could smell the faintest trace of perfume, a floral scent that didn't seem to belong in a place so heavy with sadness. She was dressed in loose, faded clothes, as though she had given up on the idea of looking presentable. She looked tired, but there was something about her, something in the way her gaze avoided mine, that made me uneasy. "Detective Raines," I introduced myself, trying to read her, trying to gauge whether this was going to be easy or not. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I need to ask you some questions about your husband." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped aside to let me in, her movements slow, almost deliberate. Her apartment was modest, but there was a certain sadness to it, an emptiness that matched the silence hanging in the air. I could see that the space was filled with reminders of a life that had been lived in quiet solitude. Photographs of a man who was no longer there, his presence now just an absence. A gap in the space where he used to be. "Please, sit down," she said, her voice thin, like it was coming from a place far away. I sat across from her, watching her every move, trying to understand what she wasn't saying. I asked her about McAllister's life, what he had been like at home, how he had changed in the weeks leading up to his death. At first, her answers were polite, detached, as though she was reciting lines from a script she had long since memorized. She spoke about how he had been a quiet man, focused on his work, never one to cause a fuss. He'd always been a good husband, she said, and they had lived a peaceful life. But the words didn't fit. They were hollow. I pressed further. Did he ever talk about his past? About anyone he might have been involved with? Her eyes flashed for just a moment, like a flicker of fear behind the mask of grief. But it was gone just as quickly. She shook her head. No, he didn't. He was private, kept to himself. Her refusal to talk felt like a wall I couldn't get past. Every answer was carefully calculated, every word chosen with precision. She wasn't just grieving, she was hiding something. I could see it in the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she reached for a glass of water, the way her shoulders stiffened when I mentioned her husband's name in connection with the investigation. I didn't want to push her too hard, not yet. I could tell she was on the edge, and one wrong move could make her shut down completely. So I kept it casual, asked her about their life together, about the friends McAllister had kept. But she never gave me any real answers. Instead, she spoke in vague generalities. How he didn't have many close friends, how he had always been content with a simple life. Everything she said felt rehearsed, almost as though she had already prepared herself for this moment, for someone to come knocking, asking about her husband's death. I could feel the tension in the room, thick like smoke, and I knew I wasn't getting the truth. Not today. But I also knew something else. This woman had a part in her husband's life, a part that I wasn't seeing. She knew more than she was willing to admit. And one day, I was going to get it out of her. Before I left, I looked at her one last time. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but there was a coldness in them now, like the sorrow had hardened into something else, something darker. As I stepped back into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just scratched the surface. McAllister's life, his death. It wasn't just about a man and his secrets. It was about the people around him, the ones who had their own parts to play. And Mrs. McAllister, she wasn't just mourning the loss of her husband. She was protecting something. I was going to have to dig deeper. I wasn't expecting much when I started tearing apart the wall. It wasn't the first time I had done it, picking through walls for hidden things people thought were safe. But this was different. I had been back at McAllister's apartment, the one he'd shared with his wife, when I noticed it. A loose brick, a small shift in the mortar. something that felt wrong. I pulled at the brick, carefully at first, but then frustration gnawed at me, and I ripped it out. The wall behind it was dusty, old. But what caught my eye wasn't just the emptiness. It was an envelope, yellowed with age, wedged deep inside the cavity like it had been there for years, waiting for someone to find it. My hands trembled as I pulled it free. The envelope was sealed tight, the edges worn from time. The kind of paper you don't find in everyday life. It looked old, older than anything McAllister had written or been involved in. There was no name on the front, no stamp, no return address, just the faintest smudge of ink along the edge. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure this letter never saw the light of day. Whoever had put it there wanted it buried forever. I opened it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and inside I found a stack of letters, each one folded neatly and scrawled with a hasty hand. The handwriting was shaky, erratic, as though the writer was pressed for time. Each letter was written with a sense of urgency, a feeling that the words on the page were meant to be hidden, kept from everyone. But not from me. The first letter was brief. I should have never gotten involved with him. You were right. I thought I could control it, thought I could walk away. But now it's too late. He knows everything, and if I don't fix this, it will all come crashing down. He's already watching me. It was signed with nothing but a single, trembling line, a name that I couldn't decipher, too blurry, too rushed. The next letter was longer, the words spilling across the page in a frenzy. He's getting too close. I should have taken care of him when I had the chance. Now he's talking to people, asking too many questions. I don't know how he found out about us, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to have to finish what I started, or we're all going down. There was a sense of finality in those words. Whoever wrote this was cornered, desperate. But it was the last line that caught me. This is bigger than you think, and McAllister is only the beginning. There's a plan, a bigger one. If you don't act soon, we're all going to burn. I kept reading, each line making me more uneasy than the last. Whoever wrote this was involved in something huge, something dangerous. And McAllister? He hadn't just been an innocent bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been part of something much darker than I had imagined. The final letter was the most chilling of all. It was written with such haste that the words barely made sense, but the meaning was clear. I should have never trusted you. It's too late now. McAllister knows everything. He's going to ruin everything. I don't know what to do anymore. The blood is on my hands. There was no signature, no name. Nothing to identify who had written it. But the sense of guilt, of a terrible decision weighing on the writer's mind, was palpable. Whoever had written this knew they were in too deep. They knew they had done something unforgivable. And now, they were running out of time to make it right. Or to hide it. I put the letters down, feeling a knot twist in my stomach. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure these letters stayed hidden, tucked away behind a wall, untouched for years. But why? Why go through all that trouble if no one was supposed to find them? It was clear now. McAllister had known something. Something that had put him in the crosshairs of people far more dangerous than I had imagined. And they had tried to keep him silent. They had tried to bury the truth with him, but it wasn't working. Not anymore. This wasn't just about one man's death. This was about something much bigger. Someone had tried to silence McAllister for good, but they had left something behind, and I was going to find out what that something was, no matter how far I had to dig. The name kept coming up, like a shadow following me no matter how much ground I covered. Gregory Thorne, a banker who had once been a key player in the heart of Manhattan's financial world. I had first seen his name scrawled across the top of McAllister's old files, mentioned in passing but with enough weight to make me dig deeper. There was something about him that didn't sit right, something I couldn't put my finger on. He had always been considered one of the cleanest, most reputable figures in the financial scene. But the thing about reputations is they don't always tell the full story. Thorne ran an institution that had been a staple in the city. An old bank, rich with history, but now defunct, swallowed up by a series of acquisitions. No one seemed to remember exactly when it had folded, just that it had vanished overnight, along with a trail of paperwork that led to nowhere. It was almost as if the bank had never existed in the first place. It was strange. too strange for a business that had handled millions in assets. And McAllister had been tangled up in it somehow, though the details were always unclear. I started with what little I could find on Thorne, a name that had been scrubbed clean, but not clean enough. He had been the face of a well-known institution, a man whose wealth and connections seemed impeccable. No rumors, no whispers, just success. His financials were pristine, his connections impressive, and his reputation spotless. Too spotless. There was nothing shady about Gregory Thorne on the surface, but McAllister had known him, and that made everything murky. I reached out to former employees of the now-defunct bank, hoping to find someone who might spill something, anything. The responses I got were tight-lipped. People didn't want to talk about Thorne, and no one wanted to talk about McAllister. But then I found something, one name that kept popping up in connection to Thorne. A woman. Her name was Elaine Carver, and according to the records, she had been McAllister's contact at the bank. She was one of Thorne's closest associates, someone who'd worked with him directly on major transactions. The problem was, Elaine Carver had disappeared a year before the bank folded, vanished, just like McAllister, except she wasn't dead. She was simply gone, without a trace. I managed to track down her last known address in an old part of the city. The place had been abandoned for months, but I wasn't about to let that stop me. I needed answers, and she was the one person who could tie everything together. The apartment was empty, just like I expected. But as I was about to leave, I spotted something on the floor. A torn-up piece of paper. A letter, crumpled and discarded, with Thorne's name on it. I unfolded the paper, trying to ignore the pit in my stomach. The words were brief but telling. "Gregory, I can't keep doing this. You know what I've sacrificed, but this is too much. I can't protect you anymore. McAllister is too close to the truth. He's figured it out, and I can't clean this up. I'm done." I read it twice, trying to piece it together. McAllister had been close to something, and whatever it was, it had something to do with Gregory Thorne. The letter wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. The message was clear. McAllister had been digging in the wrong place, and he had gotten too close to something Thorne wanted buried. Elaine had been caught in the middle, and it seemed like she had decided to walk away, though it was clear she hadn't gotten far. But why had Thorne gotten rid of her? Why did McAllister matter so much to him? I walked out of the apartment, my mind racing. I didn't know the full story yet, but I could feel it. Thorne wasn't just a banker. He was someone who had a lot to lose, and McAllister had been in the way. A man who had been too close to secrets that could bring down everything Thorne had built. And now, it seemed, those secrets were starting to rise to the surface. I knew something wasn't right the moment Gregory Thorne looked me in the eye and said, "I don't know him. I've never met Leonard McAllister." His voice was steady, confident, a little too smooth for my liking. But it wasn't the words themselves that bothered me. It was the way he said them, the way they came out so effortlessly, as if he had practiced it in front of a mirror, ready for this moment. I could tell that he was lying. Thorne sat behind his polished desk, hands steepled in front of him, like he was the one in control of this conversation. The office was what you'd expect from someone like him. Luxurious, but sterile. Every corner too carefully curated, like it had been designed to look just perfect for a man who had no flaws. But it wasn't perfect. I could feel the weight of the lie hanging in the air, and it was suffocating. "I've already told you," Thorne continued, his smile too rehearsed. "McAllister was just some accountant who worked for me. Nothing more. If he disappeared, well, that's not my business. We've had many employees come and go." I leaned forward, trying not to let my frustration show. He was hiding something, and I wasn't about to let him skate by with this charade. "Then why," I asked, "did you and McAllister share correspondence? Why was he listed in the files from your old bank?" Thorne's face tightened for just a second, but it was enough to catch it. He cleared his throat and shook his head dismissively. "It's simple. He worked on a couple of routine projects, and that's it. There's nothing to it." I didn't buy it. I could feel the weight of the words routine projects, like they were a blanket he was trying to throw over something bigger, something he didn't want me to see. I kept pushing. "Elaine Carver," I said, watching his face. "She worked with McAllister, didn't she? She was close to him." She disappeared just before the bank closed down. What do you know about that?" For a brief moment, his eyes flickered, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm everything. He knew. He knew exactly what had happened to Elaine, and it was obvious he was hiding something even bigger. "I don't know where she went, Detective," Thorne said, his voice cold now, all pretense of warmth gone. "You'll have to look somewhere else for answers. I don't know what this has to do with me." But I could see it in his eyes, the desperation, the way his hands were starting to fidget with the pen on his desk, like he was trying to find something to distract himself. He wasn't telling the truth. McAllister had been closer to Thorne than he let on, and so had Elaine Carver. The connections were too clean, too neat, and I knew better than to believe that everything about Thorne's past was just as polished as his office. I left the meeting with more questions than answers, but something in me was starting to click. Thorne's life, his story, was too perfect, too silent. People don't build empires without skeletons in their closets, and people don't lie that convincingly unless there's something to hide. Thorne had gone out of his way to distance himself from McAllister and Carver, but I knew he was tied to them somehow. The deeper I dug into the history of Thorne's bank, the more I realized the bank wasn't just a business, it was a front, a well-oiled machine that hid something far darker. I was starting to piece together a picture, a history that Thorne thought was buried, but I wasn't done yet. There was a lie here that wouldn't die, no matter how hard he tried to bury it. And soon, it was going to come back to haunt him. The more I dug into McAllister's past, the more I realized the truth was buried under layers of lies, each one carefully crafted to protect the people who had the most to lose. At first, I thought it was business. A simple financial transaction gone wrong, maybe a debt that McAllister couldn't pay off. But I was wrong. What I uncovered went far beyond that. McAllister's connection to Thorne was more than just professional. It was personal. It was a secret, one that had never seen the light of day, a hidden affair that had been tucked away, never to be spoken of. And it was that affair that had cost McAllister his life. It started with a name, a woman, Lydia Voss. At first, I couldn't figure out who she was, but the deeper I looked, the more I realized she was at the center of this tangled web. She wasn't just any woman. She was the wife of Richard Voss, one of the most powerful men in the city. Rich, influential, and deeply embedded in the financial world. A man who had the kind of connections that could make or break a career, and a marriage that seemed too perfect on the outside. But McAllister and Lydia had crossed paths, and from what I could piece together, their relationship had gone far beyond the professional. It had turned into something that could never be made public, not in the circles they moved in. The city's elite didn't tolerate such things. Scandals like this could bring everything crashing down. I found traces of Lydia in McAllister's life, tucked away in old letters and records. She had been his lover, and the affair had lasted for years. McAllister was a quiet man, but he had a side to him that he kept hidden, a side that had been tangled with the woman who was married to a man like Richard Voss. And somewhere along the way, Thorne had gotten involved, whether out of greed or obligation, I wasn't sure. But he had played his part in covering up the affair, in protecting the reputations of the powerful people who would do anything to keep their dirt from seeing the light. I followed the trail, talking to people who had been close to McAllister, people who knew Lydia. They all said the same thing. No one ever talked about it. They kept their secrets locked away in their vaults, buried deep beneath layers of wealth and power. McAllister had been careful, always staying in the background, never making waves. But someone had known, someone had found out. Lydia had tried to end it, but McAllister wouldn't let her go. And Richard Voss? He wasn't the kind of man who would forgive a betrayal like that. He had everything to lose, and if McAllister had threatened to expose the affair, then it was clear why he had to die. I finally tracked down Lydia. She had moved away years ago, but she had never left the city entirely. I found her in a small apartment on the outskirts of the Upper East Side, quiet, withdrawn. When I showed up at her door, she didn't seem surprised. She had known this moment was coming. She had known that her past would catch up with her. "I don't know what you think you know," Lydia said, her voice cold and distant. "But McAllister is dead, and there's nothing you can do about it now." "Did you love him?" I asked, watching her closely. "Did you love McAllister?" Her eyes flickered for a brief moment, a shadow crossing her face, but she quickly hid it. It doesn't matter anymore. It was a long time ago. It mattered. It mattered because McAllister had been willing to risk everything for her, and in the end, it had cost him his life. It mattered because someone had killed him to protect a secret that could have destroyed everything. The city's elite, Thorne, Voss, they had all covered their tracks. But McAllister had paid the price for their lies. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, softer. Lydia looked away, her face unreadable. "Because the people who would want to silence him are still out there. They're still watching. And they always will be." She didn't say anything else, and as I left her apartment, I realized something. McAllister had been nothing more than a pawn in a much bigger game. A game of power, money, and secrets so dangerous that people would kill to keep them buried. The affair, the lies, it had all been a mask, covering up the real reason McAllister had to die. And now I was too deep into it to back out. The connections were too strong, the stakes too high. But I was going to find out the truth, no matter what it cost me. The deeper I went into McAllister's past, the more the walls seemed to close in around me. At first, I had thought his life was just unremarkable. A man who had come to New York, settled in, and quietly disappeared. But the more I searched, the more I realized I had only scratched the surface. His past wasn't just obscure, it was erased. It started with a missing birth record. McAllister had been born in Brooklyn, or so the files claimed. But as I dug further, I found no evidence of his existence in the city's archives before a certain point. His name, Leonard McAllister, had only appeared in official records in his mid-20s, just after he had started working at the small accounting firm where he would spend the majority of his career. There were gaps that shouldn't have existed, gaps that shouldn't have been possible in a city like New York, where every detail about every citizen is accounted for. I managed to find a few old government files that seemed to indicate a different name entirely, one that had been scrubbed from every public record, erased from every document. It was as if someone had gone to great lengths to wipe him from history. The name before McAllister was one that sent a chill down my spine when I finally uncovered it. Leonard Stroud. It didn't fit the narrative he'd built for himself, the story he had sold to the world. The records I found on Stroud weren't easy to come by, but there they were, hidden in the dusty corners of the Department of Motor Vehicles database, tucked away in long-forgotten files that no one had bothered to check in years. Leonard Stroud had lived in the city long before Leonard McAllister appeared, and his name was connected to a different world, a world of troubled pasts, lost connections, and people with no desire to be found. Stroud had been a small-time criminal, running in circles that no one wanted to talk about. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was how his records disappeared. It was as if someone had used an eraser to clear him out of existence, not just from public life, but from every corner of the city's archives. I could feel the weight of the question pressing down on me. Why would someone go to such extreme lengths to bury their own past? What had Leonard Stroud done that was so terrible, so unforgivable, that he needed to become someone else entirely? And why had McAllister, this quiet, unassuming man who had worked in an office for decades, felt the need to reinvent himself in the first place? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that McAllister hadn't just been hiding from his past. He had been running from it. There was something he had done, something he had been involved in, that had forced him to vanish completely. The McAllister I had known, the man I had been investigating, was a carefully constructed lie. He wasn't who he said he was. He wasn't who he had let the world believe he was. I started to piece together the fragments of his past that I had uncovered. The name change, the missing records, the old rumors. McAllister had tried to run, to bury the man he had been. But no one can outrun their past forever. Eventually, it catches up with them. And for McAllister, it had caught up with him in the form of the very people he had tried to leave behind. What had McAllister been running from? That was the question that now haunted me. And as I looked back at the tangled mess of lies and half-truths, I realized I wasn't just trying to solve his murder. I was trying to solve the mystery of a man who had never truly existed, at least not in the way the world thought he did. I needed to find out everything I could about Leonard Stroud, about who he had been, and about why he had disappeared into the shadows. Because whoever McAllister had been running from, they were still out there. And they were still hiding something, something bigger than any of us could have imagined. The letter was the kind of thing you find when you're already in too deep. I didn't know it at the time, but it was the moment when everything changed. I had been tracing McAllister's steps, digging through records, unearthing old stories when I found a connection that led me to a hotel in the financial district, one of those luxury places with an air of exclusivity that only the city's elite would frequent, the kind of place where secrets were exchanged behind closed doors. The letter was tucked away in a drawer in a small, unremarkable room. The room hadn't been used in years, but it still carried a faint scent of cologne and cigarette smoke. It felt like a place where old deals had been struck and forgotten, until I found that letter. The envelope was weathered, the paper worn, but it had a message that was too clear to ignore. And then, as I carefully unfolded it, I saw the bloodstains. I stood frozen for a moment, my fingers trembling as I turned the letter over. It was stained, deep red, almost as if the paper itself had soaked in the life of someone who had been too careless. The stains weren't accidental, though. They were deliberate, a sign of something brutal, something personal. The letter wasn't long. It was written in hurried, jagged handwriting, like the person who had penned it had been desperate to get the words down before time ran out. As I read it, my stomach twisted. I did what I had to do. The deal was made. You were always too soft, but I couldn't let it end this way. The money is clean. But McAllister, he knows too much. I can't protect him anymore. You have to fix this. He'll ruin everything. I paused, my eyes scanning the words again. This wasn't just some casual note. This was a confession, a desperate plea, and a call to action all in one. Whoever had written this had known McAllister well. Too well. They were involved in something much larger than a simple accounting error or a bad deal. The bloodstains told the rest of the story. A death had been planned. A betrayal had been set in motion. And Leonard McAllister had paid the price for knowing too much. The handwriting wasn't familiar to me, but the name mentioned in the letter struck a nerve. It wasn't just a name. It was a signature of someone who had been tied to McAllister's life for years. It was Gregory Thorne. I could feel the pieces clicking together in my mind. Thorne had been involved in something far more sinister than I had ever imagined. The letter was clear. McAllister had known too much about a deal that had been made by someone who was willing to kill to protect their secrets. Thorne had used McAllister's skills, his quiet nature, to help hide something that could have brought down their entire operation. But McAllister had stumbled too close to the truth, and now he was dead. I had been chasing a murder, but what I was uncovering now was something far more dangerous. A conspiracy. A web of lies and betrayal that stretched deep into the heart of the financial world. One that had been meticulously hidden from the public eye. And McAllister had been the one person who had dared to pull back the curtain. As I looked at the bloodstains on the letter, I realized how far the reach of these people went. They had covered their tracks with money, power, and influence, and McAllister had been in the way. He had known too much, and now the people who had orchestrated everything were doing whatever it took to keep their secrets safe. But the letter was more than just a clue. It was a roadmap, a map that would lead me to the heart of the conspiracy. And I wasn't going to stop until I found out who was behind it all. The blood on the letter wasn't just a symbol of McAllister's death. It was a warning that I had just become a part of something far bigger than I could have ever imagined. And now I was the one who had to decide whether I was going to bury this story or whether I was going to take down the people who had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. The more I dug, the quieter everything became. People spoke in hushed tones when they spoke about McAllister, and the longer I searched, the more I realized how carefully his life and his death had been silenced. It wasn't just the absence of answers that unnerved me. It was the way everyone I spoke to seemed to know just enough to avoid telling me the whole truth. And then, when I started to press harder, the walls went up. It was as if someone had given them a script. Say nothing. I started to see it. The silence wasn't accidental. It was planned. It was deliberate. McAllister had lived in a world where silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of control. Silence was what kept people like him from being heard. Silence was what kept people like them from being exposed. The people involved in McAllister's life, Thorne, Voss, Carver, had all made sure that nothing, absolutely nothing about McAllister's past would ever see the light of day. They had wiped away his former name. They had erased his ties to the people who could ruin them. They had buried his secrets under layers of wealth and influence, and now they were doing whatever it took to keep him buried. And then there was McAllister's death. That was the part that didn't sit right with me. Someone had wanted him dead, and it wasn't just because of a business deal gone wrong. McAllister's murder had been the final piece of the puzzle, a piece that no one wanted to fall into place. The silence surrounding his death wasn't just about him. It was about protecting a system that needed to remain intact, no matter the cost. The closer I got to the truth, the clearer it became that silence was the one thing that kept the city alive. People in power knew that. They knew that if their secrets ever came to light, it would bring the entire system crumbling down. McAllister had known too much. He had started to see the connections between the men in suits, the dirty money, the betrayals that were hidden behind polished smiles. And someone had decided that McAllister was a threat to their entire world. But as much as I had uncovered, as much as I had started to put the pieces together, I knew that some secrets were too dangerous to ever come to light. It wasn't just McAllister who had paid the price. Everyone who had ever known what he was getting too close to, everyone who had been part of this invisible empire, was part of this game. They couldn't let the truth get out, and they would stop at nothing to make sure it stayed hidden. I sat in my car for a long time after I left the hotel, staring at the dark streets around me. The city was quiet, too quiet. I could feel the weight of it, the weight of all the things people kept hidden, the weight of all the lies that kept this place standing. I had started this investigation thinking it was just about a murder, but it wasn't. It had never been. McAllister had died because he had stumbled onto something bigger, something that could take down the people in power. And now, I was caught in it too. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that I wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. I was uncovering a conspiracy that had been built on silence, on control, on the need to keep the truth buried. But the silence was starting to crack, and as it did, I could feel myself getting closer to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The closer I got to the truth, the more I understood just how far the people behind McAllister's death were willing to go to protect their secrets. And I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't turn back now. Some truths are too dangerous to leave buried. But the question was, could I survive the truth when it finally came to light? The bookstore was tucked away in a narrow alley near the docks, the kind of place most people would pass by without giving it a second thought. The sign outside was faded, the windows half covered in dust, and the door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old paper, mildew, and something else. Something unsettling. The shelves stretched all the way to the ceiling, filled with books no one had bothered to look at in years. But it wasn't the books I was after. I had heard rumors about this place, whispers that McAllister had visited here often, that he had spent hours combing through old documents and forgotten journals. No one knew exactly why, but they said it was the kind of place where people went when they were looking for answers they couldn't find anywhere else. Answers that were too dangerous to ask out loud. As I walked through the aisles, I felt the weight of something pressing down on me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew McAllister had been here, that this place held the key to everything I had been chasing. The farther I went into the store, the more I felt like I was stepping into his world, into the life he had hidden from everyone, including me. At the back of the store, tucked in a corner behind piles of neglected books, I found what I was looking for. A collection of journals, notes, and documents, all crammed together on a wooden table. Some of the papers were old, brittle with age, but others looked new, like they had been placed there recently. I didn't need to look at the name on the cover of the first journal to know whose it was. McAllister's handwriting was unmistakable. I flipped it open, scanning the pages, and I could feel my heart rate quicken. The words jumped off the page, describing transactions, meetings, and names that were all too familiar. There were entries about McAllister's involvement with Thorne, Carver, and Lydia Voss. But there were more names too. Names I didn't recognize. Names that didn't belong in this world. People from the shadows, people who had been hidden away, their connections to McAllister buried under layers of deception. The deeper I read, the more I understood. McAllister hadn't just stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to know. He had been involved in something much bigger than he could have imagined. He had been an unwilling player in a game that was controlled by people with too much power to let a single mistake ruin them. But McAllister had gotten too close to the truth. He had been drawn into this world by a hunger for money, power, and control, just like the rest of them. But in the end, it had cost him his life. I turned the page of one journal and saw a list of transactions, money being moved between accounts, large sums of cash sent to untraceable sources. But what caught my attention was the name that appeared on nearly every page: the network. It wasn't a name I had heard before, but it felt important, like a key to the puzzle that had been locked away for so long. McAllister had written about it in his journals like it was something he was trying to understand, something he had been following for months. The network was more than just a group of people. It was an operation, a vast, hidden entity that controlled the flow of money and power beneath the city's surface. And McAllister had been caught in the middle of it all. As I read through the pages, I realized McAllister hadn't just been a pawn. He had been trying to break free from something he didn't understand, trying to find a way out of a dangerous game. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized that there was no way out. Every move he made had led him closer to the people who were running the show, the people who would stop at nothing to protect their empire. I picked up the final document, a letter, written in the same frantic handwriting that had appeared in the other journals. It was addressed to McAllister directly, but there was no sender. The words were desperate, urging him to stop digging, to let it go. Whoever had written it knew exactly what McAllister had uncovered. They knew how dangerous it was, how close McAllister had come to exposing everything. The letter ended with a chilling warning. "There's no way out, Leonard. They will find you before you find them. And when they do, you won't just lose your life, you'll lose everything you've ever known." I closed the letter and sat back, my mind racing. McAllister had tried to uncover a conspiracy, and in doing so, he had uncovered more than just dirty deals. He had uncovered a network, a shadow operation that reached far beyond the people I had been investigating. And now, I was caught in it too. I wasn't just uncovering a murder anymore. I was uncovering a system of control, a group of people so powerful that they would do anything to keep their secrets hidden. And the deeper I went, the more I realized the people behind this weren't just involved in McAllister's death. They had been pulling strings for years, and they were willing to kill anyone who threatened to expose them. I stood up, the weight of what I had just learned pressing down on me. I had to keep going. I had to find out who was behind the network, who was orchestrating this entire operation. Because now, the only thing that mattered was uncovering the truth. And if I didn't, I knew I would become part of their game, just like McAllister. The deeper I dug, the more I heard the same names echoing in my head. Names that seemed to be connected to McAllister, but whose significance had been carefully hidden behind layers of wealth and influence. Politicians, businessmen, members of the city's elite. They were the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes, the ones who made the decisions that shaped the city in ways no one ever saw. And each of them had crossed paths with McAllister at one point or another. But they weren't talking. Not to me. Not to anyone. The more I traced these names, the clearer it became that McAllister hadn't been just a small-time accountant who'd gotten caught in the crossfire. He had been a pawn in something far bigger. He had been the person who had gotten too close to a world he shouldn't have known about. A world where the stakes weren't just money and power. They were life and death. Each time I mentioned McAllister's name, people tensed. It was subtle at first, a slight change in their expression, a stiffening of their shoulders, but I saw it. I heard the hesitation in their voices when they spoke about him. They all knew who he was. They all knew what he had been involved in. And they all knew that if the truth came out, it could bring down everything they had worked to protect. They didn't need to say it. Their silence said enough. The more I pressed, the more I realized how deep this went. McAllister had uncovered something that threatened to unravel a network of corruption that stretched across the highest levels of power. The people I had been speaking to, people in politics, people in business, had all crossed paths with him. Each of them had their own reasons to keep their mouths shut. Some of them had been involved in the same dirty deals. Some had watched McAllister get too close to the truth, and some had decided that silence was the only way to protect themselves. I started to hear the names of influential businessmen like Thomas Albright, a developer who had built half of the city's skyline, and Senator Charles Westbrook, a man whose influence reached into every corner of state and national politics. These weren't just businessmen and politicians. These were the men who ran the city, and they were all connected to McAllister. Albright had been one of McAllister's clients, someone McAllister had worked with on several high-stakes transactions. Westbrook, on the other hand, had been a friend of Thorne's, a political ally who had used his influence to smooth over some of the bank's less-than-legal activities. I started to piece together how McAllister had been tied to these men, how, in his quiet, unassuming way, he had become entangled in their dirty dealings. But what struck me the most was how quickly they had all shut down when I mentioned his name. Westbrook had practically dismissed McAllister as a nobody, a small player in a much bigger game. But I knew better. McAllister had been a small player, yes, but he had been a player nonetheless. He had been someone who had learned too much, seen too much, and tried to walk away. I spent hours going through documents, looking for something, anything, that would tie these men together. And that's when I found it. A series of emails, encrypted and carefully hidden away, linking Albright, Westbrook, and Thorne in a web of shady financial deals. The deals weren't just about money. They were about influence, about power, and about keeping people in line. McAllister had known about these deals. He had been a part of them. But he hadn't known enough to understand the danger he was in. He had been a cog in a machine that he thought he could escape from. But once you're in the game, there's no getting out. These men had killed once to keep their secrets safe. They had silenced McAllister, and now they were doing everything they could to make sure nothing else came to light. And as I connected the dots between their names, the more I realized just how much was at stake. These weren't just businessmen and politicians. They were the kind of people who would go to any lengths to protect their power. I wasn't just investigating a murder anymore. I was uncovering a conspiracy, a system that had been built on lies and silence, and these men were willing to do whatever it took to keep it standing. I knew I was getting closer to the truth, but I also knew the danger that came with it. These people had already killed to protect their secrets. What would they do if I got too close? The broken record kept playing, over and over again. McAllister's name, these same powerful men, and the silence that surrounded them. It wasn't just a murder anymore. It was a warning. And I had to decide whether I was going to be the next person they silenced or the one who finally brought the truth to light. I had been chasing shadows for weeks, sifting through fragments of McAllister's life, piece by piece. The closer I got to the truth, the more the people around him had pulled away, their silence like a heavy cloak draped over everything. His wife, Lydia, had been the final piece of the puzzle, the one person who could connect all the dots. But she hadn't spoken. Not until now. I knew the moment I saw her again that she was finally ready to say something. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from too many sleepless nights. But there was a flicker of something else. Guilt, fear. Something that made her look smaller, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her before. When I walked into her apartment, the tension in the room was palpable. She didn't look at me at first, her gaze fixed somewhere far away, as if she were still grappling with the reality of everything that had happened. Her hands shook slightly as she set a cup of coffee on the table between us. "I know why you're here," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, watching her, waiting. She knew this moment had come. It had always been inevitable. McAllister's death had been a slow unraveling of secrets. Secrets that led me here, to this apartment, where the truth was finally about to be told. Lydia had kept her silence for so long, but the burden of it had been too much for her to bear. I could see it in her eyes. "McAllister wasn't who you thought he was," she started, her voice faltering. "He was involved in things I didn't understand, things he never wanted me to know." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "What kind of things?" Her breath caught, and she looked away, as though the words were stuck in her throat. But after a long moment, she spoke again, her voice quieter, more hesitant. He was laundering money for years. It started small, you know, just moving funds around, making sure no one noticed. But over time, it grew, bigger and bigger. McAllister was handling money that wasn't supposed to be touched, and once you're in that world, there's no getting out. She paused, as if the weight of what she was saying was too much to carry. Her eyes flicked toward the window, as though expecting someone to be watching. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. But he couldn't keep me in the dark forever. Eventually, I saw the way people treated him, the way they looked at him. Like he was just another pawn in their game. He was working with people far more dangerous than I could ever imagine. People who played by rules I didn't even understand. I stayed silent, absorbing her words. She wasn't finished yet. The stolen goods, the shipments that came in, the people he had to protect. It was too much for one man to handle. But McAllister was determined to keep me out of it. He tried to protect me, but it was never enough. He kept pushing, kept going deeper into the mess, and the more he tried to get out, the more they pulled him back in. I could hear the remorse in her voice, but it wasn't just guilt, it was fear. Fear of what would happen if she spoke too much, if she said the wrong thing. "There's more," she whispered, looking up at me with a sudden urgency. "There's something I never told you. The last piece of the puzzle. McAllister didn't just get involved in this by accident. He was chosen. Someone made him do it." I didn't understand. "What do you mean he was chosen?" Her face paled even further, the color draining from her skin. McAllister wasn't the only one who was being used. There were others, people who worked with him, people who owed favors, people who were pulled into something they didn't understand. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. And McAllister... She paused, swallowing hard. McAllister was in too deep. He was getting too close to something they couldn't afford to have exposed. I was on the edge of my seat, leaning forward. Who was pulling the strings? Who was behind all of this? She looked away, her gaze distant as if she were trying to block out the memory. I don't know who they were, but I know one thing. Thorne was involved. He always was. He's the one who brought McAllister in. He used him, manipulated him. And when McAllister got too close to uncovering everything, they decided he had to be silenced. The truth hit me like a cold wave. Thorne wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just some banker trying to protect his assets. He had orchestrated this whole thing, McAllister's involvement, his rise in the financial world, and his slow descent into the world of corruption and crime. But there was one thing that Lydia hadn't said, one last confession that lingered in the air, heavy with implication. "I don't know how they did it," she said, her voice breaking. But McAllister was going to expose everything. They didn't just want him quiet, they wanted him gone. And now it's too late. I sat there for a long time, the weight of her words sinking in. McAllister's death hadn't been a random act of violence. It hadn't been some accident or casualty of business. It had been a deliberate, calculated move to silence him, to make sure he never got the chance to expose the truth. But as I looked at Lydia, I realized something else. She wasn't just the wife of a man who had been killed. She had been part of it. She had known everything. And now, she was telling me what she knew. But there was one final truth she hadn't shared. The truth that no matter how hard I tried, no matter how many pieces I uncovered, would keep me from seeing the full picture. I wasn't done yet. But Lydia had already said the most important thing. McAllister's death wasn't just about one man. It was about something bigger, something I hadn't even begun to understand. And whoever was behind this, whoever had pulled the strings, was still out there, still watching, and still willing to do whatever it took to keep their secrets safe. The closer I got to the truth, the tighter the noose seemed to get around me. Every corner I turned, every person I spoke to, all pointed to the same thing. Someone wanted me to stop. Someone didn't want me digging any deeper. And whoever they were, they had eyes everywhere. I had learned too much. The pieces of McAllister's life, His death and the conspiracy I had uncovered were all coming together. Thorne, Voss, the mysterious network. It was all too interconnected, too dangerous. But the more I pieced it together, the more I realized that the people behind it were willing to do whatever it took to make sure the truth never saw the light of day. I was in their sights now. It wasn't subtle either. The signs were there, too obvious to ignore. I started noticing cars following me, shadows lurking around corners, a sense that I was never alone. The air felt thicker, like the walls were closing in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched at all times, that every step I took was being calculated. I tried to keep going, to keep moving forward, but the pressure was building, and I could feel the weight of it. The more I uncovered, the more desperate they seemed to get. I could hear whispers in the street, see quick glances from strangers who were too careful with their eyes. Every move I made was met with resistance. Every door I knocked on was quickly slammed shut. And then it happened. I was meeting with an informant, someone who had been feeding me bits and pieces of information for weeks. I was supposed to meet him in a small, secluded cafe near the docks. When I arrived, the place was empty, quiet. Too quiet. The lights flickered and I felt an uneasy tension in the air. I ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't long before I saw him, my informant, sitting in the back booth. But as I approached, something didn't sit right. His posture was stiff and his eyes darted nervously around the room. I didn't need to say a word. I knew something was wrong. As soon as I reached the table, he stood up quickly, his hand shooting out toward mine in a gesture that looked far too rehearsed. Before I could say anything, he whispered urgently, They know you're getting close." I didn't understand at first, but the fear in his voice was undeniable. Then a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned just in time to see two men in dark suits entering the cafe, their eyes locked on me. They weren't even pretending to be subtle. They were here for me. My heart raced as I stood up, taking my informant by the arm. "Get out of here," I muttered, dragging him toward the back exit. But it was already too late. The door slammed open, and I knew they'd been waiting for this moment. The trap had been set. They had known I would show up. They had been waiting to catch me. I pushed my informant out the door first, shoving him into the alley, then followed quickly, but not fast enough. One of the men grabbed me by the shoulder, pulling me back with force. I spun around, my fist landing a blow that connected with his jaw, but it was a weak, desperate attempt. He barely flinched. I was trapped. The man I had hit pushed me against the wall with a strength that knocked the breath out of me. The other one stepped closer, his hand on the gun at his hip, eyes cold. "You've been asking too many questions," he said, his voice low. "It's time for you to stop." I was already trying to think of my next move, planning my escape in my mind. But every thought felt heavier, slower. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold out. But then something changed in the air. A shift, a noise from down the alley, the sound of tires screeching, another car pulling up. The two men froze, and for a moment everything stood still. The tension in the air was so thick I could barely breathe. I knew I had to act quickly. I wasn't going to make it out alive if I didn't. I twisted my body out of the man's grip, using the split second of distraction to shove him hard, knocking him back against the wall. The other man pulled his gun, but before he could aim, a single shot rang out from the distance, a loud crack of gunfire. The man with the gun dropped to the ground, and I was already moving, running down the alley, pulling my informant with me. I didn't know who had fired the shot, but I wasn't going to stop to find out. Not now. Not when I was so close. We kept running, sprinting toward the next corner, my heart hammering in my chest. The trap had been set. I had walked right into it, but somehow I had survived. For now. As I ducked into a side street and looked back over my shoulder, I realized one thing for certain. I wasn't just close to the truth. I was in it now. And the people behind this conspiracy weren't going to stop until I was gone. They'd already killed once to keep their secrets buried. What would they do next to make sure no one else uncovered them? I couldn't stop now. The game had changed, and I was too close to the truth to turn back. I knew someone was following me. It was subtle at first, just a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, a figure darting across the street when I turned a corner. But the feeling of being watched, of being tracked, became impossible to ignore. It wasn't paranoia. It was something far more dangerous. I was being hunted, but not in the way I expected. The city's streets had always been full of strangers, people coming and going, blending in, disappearing into the crowds. But now it was different. There was one person, one ghost, who seemed to be at every turn, always just out of sight, always keeping their distance but never far enough away for me to feel safe. I tried to shake the feeling. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, someone with similar habits, someone who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more I realized that I wasn't being followed by accident. This person knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't until I found the note that I realized who had been tailing me all along. It was hidden, tucked inside a folded newspaper, slipped under the door of my apartment just as I was getting ready to leave. The handwriting was neat, but the words were hurried, like they'd been written in a panic. The message was short, but it hit me like a slap in the face. I know who killed McAllister. I've been watching you. I know what you're trying to do. But you need to stop. They're not just after you. They're after everyone who knows too much. The note wasn't signed, but I knew who it was from. It was the person who had been following me. They had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to step forward. And now, they were warning me, don't dig any deeper. I knew I had to find them. I knew they had answers. This was the witness I had been waiting for, the one person who knew everything, who knew who had killed McAllister and why. They had been hiding in the shadows, just like me, terrified of what might happen if they spoke. But their silence wasn't just out of fear. It was survival. I had to meet them, to hear what they had to say. But I also knew that this wasn't going to be easy. Whoever they weren't going to trust me. I was too close to the truth. I had already ruffled enough feathers. This person had been hiding for a reason, and that reason wasn't just to protect themselves. It was to stay alive. I spent the next few days trying to trace their steps, trying to find any sign of them. I followed the few leads I had, small details, unnoticed things, all pointing in the same direction. And then, one night, I found them. It was in a narrow alley just off one of the quieter streets in Lower Manhattan, a place where no one ever really went unless they had a reason. The same alley I had passed through countless times before, but this time there was someone waiting for me. They stepped out from the shadows, their face partially obscured by a hood, but I could see their eyes. They were wide with fear. Fear, but also relief. The moment they saw me, they hesitated, like they were weighing their options, whether to speak or run. But they didn't run. "You're the one they've been following," they said, their voice low, almost a whisper. "I've seen you asking questions. I've seen them watching you. They won't stop until you're gone." I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to process what they were saying. "You know who killed McAllister?" I asked, my voice tight with urgency. The person nodded slowly, looking around nervously. "I know who did it, but I can't tell you. Not yet. If I do, they'll kill me too." I stepped closer, desperate. "You have to tell me. If you know who did this, if you know why McAllister had to die." "I know," they interrupted, their voice shaking. "I know why he died. And I know who pulled the strings. But it's not just about McAllister anymore. It's about something bigger. It's about the people he was working for, and the people they answer to." I could feel the weight of their words pressing down on me, the gravity of the situation settling in. Whoever had killed McAllister wasn't just a killer. They were part of something far larger, something that had been operating in the shadows for years. And now, I was in too deep. I had uncovered a secret that was too dangerous to expose. The people who were behind this, they weren't just going to let me walk away. I took a deep breath, my hand resting on the cold brick of the alley. "You need to trust me. I can protect you. But you have to tell me what you know. You can't hide anymore." The person hesitated again, their eyes darting around the alley, checking for anyone who might be watching. After what felt like an eternity, they stepped closer, lowering their voice to a whisper. McAllister didn't just find out about the network. He was part of it. And when he tried to leave, they decided to silence him. But he wasn't the first. And he won't be the last. The words hung in the air like a threat, a warning that sent a chill down my spine. I was no longer just chasing a killer. I was chasing a conspiracy, a machine that had been built to protect itself at all costs. The silent witness had spoken, but their words had only opened the door to a truth darker than I had ever imagined. I stood on the edge of the precipice, looking out at a landscape I hadn't fully understood until now. Every clue, every whispered name, every sleepless night had led me here, finally piecing together the truth about McAllister's death and the forces that had controlled it from the shadows. But the final piece, the one I had been missing all this time, had just clicked into place. McAllister had never been the innocent, unassuming man I had thought him to be. He had been part of something, part of a larger network, one that stretched far deeper into the city's financial and political systems than I had ever imagined. The quiet accountant who had once worked for Thorne had been just another cog in a massive machine, a machine that thrived on corruption, deceit, and power. McAllister had been more than just a pawn. He had been a necessary pawn. But in the end, even pawns are sacrificed when they get too close to the king. The network, the shadow operation I had uncovered, was vast. It wasn't just a few shady businessmen or crooked politicians. It was a system of control that stretched all the way to the top. It was the banks, the government, the city itself, all bound together by a web of influence so thick that no one could see where it began or ended. McAllister had been in too deep. He had seen too much, and when the time came, they had eliminated him. They had made an example of him. But his death wasn't just about him. It was a warning to anyone who might dare to threaten the delicate balance of power they had spent decades building. I couldn't help but feel a sense of nausea rise in my stomach as I thought about everything McAllister had been caught up in. He had been trying to leave it all behind, trying to walk away. But once you're tangled in this kind of corruption, there's no leaving. There's no getting out. McAllister had thought he could walk away with his conscience intact, but instead he had walked straight into the heart of a conspiracy that could swallow him whole. And in the end, it had. But what about the rest of them? The ones who had been behind all of this, the ones who had orchestrated McAllister's death and so many others. I had learned their names. I knew their faces. But they were still out there, still pulling the strings, still playing their game. And now, it was my turn to make a move. I realized something then. This wasn't just about uncovering McAllister's death anymore. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about something bigger, something more dangerous. The more I learned, the more I saw how intertwined these people were with everything in the city. The money, the power, the control. This wasn't just one man's death. It was the beginning of a much larger battle, one that threatened to expose the very system that had been carefully built over decades. I could feel the weight of it settling on me. I wasn't just chasing a killer anymore. I wasn't just trying to solve a murder. I had uncovered a conspiracy, a game of chess played by people who had no intention of losing. McAllister had been nothing more than a pawn, a small, insignificant player in a game too large for him to comprehend. But his death had set something in motion. It had made me a player in that game too. As I walked away from the final piece of the puzzle, I felt a sense of purpose rise within me. I wasn't just going to let this go. I couldn't. I had come too far, and I knew too much. The truth was out there, and I was the one who had to bring it to light. But I also knew one thing. Nothing in this city came without a price, and the price of uncovering this truth could cost me everything. I had no illusions left. The people behind this, Thorne, Voss, the others, had already shown me what they were capable of. They had already killed once to protect their secrets. But I wasn't going to be another victim. I was going to take this fight to them. I was going to expose the truth no matter the cost, because the truth, once it's uncovered, has a way of setting everything in motion. And once the pieces were in place, there would be no stopping the game. The only question now was who would come out on top, and I wasn't ready to be the one left in the dust. The final piece was in place. Now, the game had begun. I thought I had all the pieces. I thought I had uncovered everything, McAllister's death, the people behind it, the conspiracy that had festered beneath the city's polished surface for decades. I had the names, the connections, the evidence that tied it all together. But as I sat there, looking at everything I had gathered, a cold realization settled in. The truth wasn't enough. McAllister's death wasn't just a random act of violence. It wasn't just the result of a financial deal gone wrong or a man caught in the crossfire of a shady transaction. No, it was about something bigger, something that went beyond money, beyond power, beyond the people who controlled the city's wealth and politics. It was about control. The secret McAllister had uncovered was buried so deep that even time itself couldn't wash it away. It was a secret that tied the city's elite to a dark, unspoken pact. A pact that stretched across generations, a network of power and manipulation that had been carefully hidden from the public eye. And McAllister, in his quiet way, had gotten too close. He had uncovered something he wasn't supposed to see, something that threatened to unravel everything they had built. And for that, he had to die. But now, I was left with the truth that had cost me so much to uncover. I had the pieces, I had the names, I had the connections. But none of it mattered. The system was too powerful. The people behind it had too much to lose. They had already killed once to protect their secrets. What would they do to keep them buried forever? I had been so sure that uncovering the truth would bring justice. But now, as I sat in the quiet of my office, surrounded by the scattered pages and documents that told the story, I realized something. Justice wasn't going to come. Not for McAllister, not for me, not for anyone who had dared to ask the wrong questions. Some stories don't get their ending. Some secrets stay buried. Forever. The truth I had uncovered wasn't a weapon. It was a liability. A liability to the people in power, to the people who ran the city. The deeper I had dug, the more I had realized that the truth was the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. And now, I had it. But what good was it? I could expose everything. I could take it to the media, to the public. I could let the world know what I had uncovered, show everyone the darkness that lurked beneath the city's glossy surface. But I knew better than anyone what would happen if I did. The truth would be buried. The people behind it would protect themselves at any cost. And I would be gone, just like McAllister, just like the others who had tried to uncover it before me. I had no illusions left. I had no naive hope that things would change. The system was too powerful, too entrenched. The people at the top would do anything to keep the truth from coming out, to keep their world intact. And the truth, it would die with me. Like it had died with McAllister. Like it had died with everyone who had come too close. I stood up from my desk, the weight of the knowledge heavy on my shoulders. I had come too far to turn back, but I knew now that some battles were never meant to be won. Some secrets were too dangerous to expose, too deeply rooted to ever be pulled from the ground. And no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't undo what had already been done. McAllister had paid the price for seeking the truth, and now, it seemed, I was going to have to live with the cost of it. Because some truths, no matter how hard you try, never get their ending. Some stories end before they ever truly begin. And the secret that McAllister had uncovered, it would stay buried, just like the city wanted, forever.